Welcome to Altera Vista. My name is Lisa Ledwidge. I'm the U.S. Outreach Director for the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. We're going to be talking for the next hour with Dr. Arjun Makhijani about anti-globalization, about global economic justice. Dr. Makhijani is the author of a book called From Global Capitalism to Economic Justice. The subtitle is An Inquiry into the Elimination of Systemic Poverty, Violence, and Environmental Destruction in the World Economy. And this issue is timely because in the last year, 2, maybe 3 years, we've been seeing a lot on the TV and in the news about anti-globalization. Seattle, Genoa, Washington, D.C., throngs of people would turn out and protest globalization. And we're going to talk about that today for the next hour. Dr. Makhijani, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Lisa.
I want to ask you, what made you write this book? How did you come to write it?
Well, I had a lot of youthful enthusiasm. I am from India. I was born in Karachi and brought up in Bombay. And when I was doing my doctorate at Berkeley in the early 70s, I thought I should go to the villages and work. And what I knew how to do was energy systems, and I looked into energy and agriculture. But when I went back in the mid-70s to India, I found that I really didn't know anything about the villages. I was trying to figure out why so many Indians were poor in technical terms. And I came up with technical answers. Well, they don't have efficient energy systems, they don't have enough energy, and so I thought I'd build biogas plants and so on. Very conventional answers. But when I actually started working in the village, I found I was an upper-class city boy who didn't really know much about the problems of women, of water, of exploitation. And so I started essentially an inquiry into how the global economic system works, but sitting there in the village. So my life got transformed because I found myself, with all my degrees, very ignorant about the real problems of real people in villages in India, even though I was from India.
And you have worked in India's villages, you've organized for nuclear disarmament in the United States, and now you're the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. And I know that, tell me a little bit about the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, even though I know about it, because I work there too. But tell the audience about the Institute.
Well, in the early 80s, there were many problems with nuclear weapons production's environmental and health effects coming to light. Atomic veterans were getting sick and getting cancer. Many people were discovering lots of nuclear waste in their neighborhood, and there weren't any technical people to give advice and evaluate what was going on in people's neighborhoods right here in the United States from nuclear weapons production. It was supposed to be about national security. That's what people were told, but people were finding they were getting sick, and the government wasn't giving them the true story. And so, since I'm a technical person, I began to look into matters involving waste, pollution, radiation in the environment, health effects, and so on. And after Mr. Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet system started to crumble, it became possible to work like this. Foundations began to support work looking into the health and environmental effects, and to provide ordinary people living near nuclear facilities with good science. And that's what we do. We provide good science to ordinary people on nuclear weapons issues, security issues, energy issues. We're a nonprofit institute located just outside of Washington, D.C.
And your book talks a lot about the energy and environment connection, and it talks about a lot of other things as well, but I want you to talk a little bit about what your book has to say about energy and oil and the connections there.
Well, lots of people know that capitalism is, in its modern form, is hundreds of years old. People know about Christopher Columbus and the discovery of the Americas, and how the Native Americans were pushed aside and killed, and so on. They know about many of those sides. They also know about many of the technological accomplishments of capitalism, the computers, the cars, and the transportation systems, the efficient factories, and so on. But there's often not a connection being made between how these two pieces of the puzzle fit together. And that's where the technological and the energy part comes in. In the late 18th century, when steam power first was discovered and applied to transportation and industry, and in the early 19th century, the whole world changed dramatically. Before that, trade was very, very small, and it happened in very precious commodities that had small volume, easy to transport, very high value: gold, pepper, salt, spices. All of these things were very high value, and because it was very hard to transport things and dangerous.
And what time of the history are you talking about here?
So in the late 18th century and early 19th century, when ships began to be powered by steam, it became possible to transport lots of people in a hurry. It became possible to transport bulk goods very cheaply, so wheat could be transported, so coal could be transported.
A major change to the global economy, in other
Yes.
words.
So it became possible to divide labor, as they say, the global division of labor, where entire regions became specialized in just growing cotton and nothing else or little else, and exporting cotton and becoming dependent on other regions. And so that gave a completely new cast to, say, the conquest of Africa and Asia by European powers, and also to expansion by Europe and Europeans into the Americas. It became completely different as a result of technology, of ships, of railroads, and later on of motorized vehicles.
So we're talking a lot about Europe, and then what happened with the United States? What about the United States? Your book does talk quite a bit about the U.S. and taking off from where you left off. What about the settlers that came from Europe to the United States?
Well, there were two pieces of the European expansion, or what might be called European imperialism, because that was actually a very well-liked word in the 19th century. The Victorian era, empire, emporiums where you could get everything. Words deriving from empire were much liked, and maybe we're getting back into that same era because empire is being glorified again these days.
I think that'd be dangerous.
It would be very dangerous, and it is showing itself to be very dangerous. But there were two pieces of European expansion. One was, for instance, the British conquest of India, which was completed in by the mid-19th century, where the huge population of India was used to cultivate food and cotton and other raw materials for British industry, which was protected from imports from places like India of finished products. At the same time, finished products were like textiles, were being marketed in India, and the Indian cottage industries were put out of business. So the large population base of India was used to sustain a protected British economy. And similarly, the French and so on, the European powers expanded into Africa for raw materials. The American expansions in North America and a parallel expansion in Australia were different, because they involved the bulk movement of European people into what was regarded as empty lands. And of course, they were not empty. They were Native Americans here, and they were pushed aside, cast into reservations, or killed. And that happened here. It happened in Canada. It happened in Australia. And the lands were used to grow food, and the railroads were then built to take out that food, and some of it was exported to England. Germany did the same in Russia. And what happened was high prosperity areas grew up in Western Europe, England, Germany, and other countries, where they were essentially importing raw materials and food in bulk at very low prices and exporting their poverty. So of course part of this was the slave trade and slave-grown cotton in the United States, which led to the Civil War.
Now, your book talks about militarism and weapons and violence linked to what you've just been talking about. Help make that link for us.
Well, when the global division of labor didn't happen because everybody was happy with it. The global division of labor was accompanied by force. So the British conquest of India, which began in 1757, was first just expropriating the goods that were produced there for export in third parts in countries of the world. Bangladesh was the center of world textile manufacturers in the 18th century. but that was essentially all destroyed. And Indian agriculture was completely reoriented toward the satisfaction of the needs of the British economy, and then secondarily to the satisfaction of the needs of the Indian economy. That required the suppression of Indian domestic needs by force. And that was accomplished by a very vast British army, which consisted mostly of Indians. They appointed a lot of Indian tax collectors and bureaucrats and Maharajas, who were essentially princes who were collecting their taxes. And of course, on this side of the Atlantic, the occupation and conquest of the United States involved an enormous amount of force, many wars with Native Americans. There was the Mexican War, which expropriated half or good bit of Mexico into the United States. So this expansion and consolidation of riches into Europe from the rest of the world and the occupation of a good part of the world by Europeans was done by force. And that's where the military came in, and that's where the nationalist glorification of military ideas and military structures within countries also came in.
I've heard you mention a good quote by Thomas Friedman that kind of gets to this link between economy and military, and I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, Thomas Friedman, as you may know, is a New York Times columnist, and he has said he supports corporate globalization as a force for freedom and democracy and prosperity, and yes, but he has observed that McDonald's in Beijing cannot be a global corporation rooted in the United States without the military power of the United States. McDonald's needs McDonnell Douglas, which makes the F-15s. Actually, there was a general, Marine general, during the early part of the 20th century who wrote even more colorfully. Mm-hmm. His name was Smedley Butler. And in the mid-30s, he said, I was part of the elite armed forces of the United States, and I was a general in the U.S. Marines, and I was out there. This is obviously a paraphrase. I don't have the exact quote in front of me to read, but he said essentially that he was guarding the interests for the banks and the corporations in Central America and Nicaragua and Cuba and Haiti, and securing China for Standard Oil, and essentially for the corporate and banking interests. And that he said he could have taught Al Capone a few lessons, because Al Capone operated in 3 districts in one city, whereas he operated for the U.S. in 3 continents. So he was quite colorful.
And so back then, that was in the early 20th century, I think, that he made that. Smedley Butler made that quote, and Thomas Friedman made his quote just a few years ago, I think.
Right.
So
right.
What you were just talking about in your book, the history of colonialization and taking out the raw materials from the colonized states, some of this kind of culture, or some of the remnants of this idea of empire remain today. And I want you to talk about oil in this respect.
Well, oil became a very central part of the imperial and capitalist enterprise in the 20th century, and actually has its roots in the military. In the British military, Mr. Winston Churchill, who's quite famous from his World War II leadership of Britain, was very involved in the transition of the British military, especially the Navy, to oil, because coal, which powered the Navy in the 19th century, was available in England. And then they had to decide whether they were going to go to oil, which they did not have, but which might be available in places like the Middle East or the United States, which was an oil exporter at the time. And so they'd essentially be dependent for a very vital part of their military machine, which was necessary to maintain the empire, on an energy resource which they didn't have at home. So, but they did make the transition because oil is so much more efficient than coal. It's much more dense, that is, a small volume has much more energy than coal, and so the ships could range much farther They could be much faster, they'd be more powerful. You could have submarines powered with oil, very difficult to power submarines with coal. So the conversion of the British Navy to oil, also, of course other navies also converted, was really the start of the modern era along with World War I, when war became fast and ruthless. Of course, Hitler's Panzers and the tanks in World War II are very famous.
And this took place in the early 1900s?
In the early 1900s, during World War I. And so the competition for oil resources, both for the commercial economy, but really at first to achieve military supremacy and rapidity, started in the first half of the 20th century. And then General Motors and Standard Oil and Firestone brought it into the civilian economy in a spectacular way after World War I. But of course, even before World War I, we had Henry Ford and the Model T.
So we've been talking a lot about corporations here, and your book talks about corporations. Are you anti-corporation?
No, I'm not anti-corporation, actually. I'm anti a system where there is no accountability of the main structures of the economy that are supposed to be in the service of people and prosperity to those very people. So corporations as they are currently structured, especially large corporations, are very anti-democratic. They're completely unaccountable. They range all over the world. They pollute all over the world, but they have no global structures to rein them in. Corporations today are bigger. The largest corporations like Exxon or Vivendi or Ford Motor Company or General Motors or Toyota are much, much larger than the economies of most countries.
Yeah.
So they can actually buy and sell governments. They can rent brigades of armies from countries to guard the pipelines. So they are so much more powerful. What I'm against is a system in which corporations have put profit and greed and global ranging and picking up in one place, destroying the economy if they don't like it, rendering people unemployed and just moving over the border where there's cheaper labor, and they have no accountability to the communities in which they operate, the people they employ, and very often the products that they produce when there isn't a governmental system to say you have to produce a safe product or an efficient product. That's what I'm against.
And so you don't see the U.S. government or the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund or any of these kind of either state or international bodies as doing a good job of making them accountable?
No, they are doing a very good job at what they were set up to do. These institutions were set up to promote corporate profit and capitalism according to a very regressive creed, and a creed that actually doesn't stand up to the scientific test of what's actually going on in the world. That unfettered capitalism, if you allow capital to flow any place, that it will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and people will actually prosper. If you look at the state of Africa today, if you look at Mexico today, if you look at India today, if you look at very large numbers of places, and China is an exception which I wrote about, and that exception is actually connected to the fact that they had a relatively equalitarian revolution, very violent, and I do not support the kind of violence that happened and the dictatorship which they still have, but it is a fact. They had land redistribution, like South Korea, which had land redistribution in a different dictatorial system. But the foundation of their prosperity isn't globalization. The foundation of their prosperity is in a system where people first had control of their local economy, which we don't have, and which the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization are actually dedicated to destroying local control. I don't think they are about making corporations accountable. They are about making local economies subject to corporations. So corporations have become much less accountable to governments than they were before. Now they can skip around. If they don't like one country and one country has rules they don't like, they can simply jump into another country because they can simply move their money out without any accountability.
And so even though China and Korea had dictatorial regimes that imposed these strictures, you're still saying that that was a better system than what's happening today in many countries?
Well, I don't say it's a better system. I mean, India and China is a frequent comparison that is made. And actually, I think the best system is in a corner of India, which the system that I'm a fan of. I'm not a fan of the Chinese system, and I'm not a fan overall of what has happened in India. Even though India has an electoral democracy that is very successful, and I think it is wonderful, it's a great achievement of the struggle for independence, which was led by Gandhi, which is admired the world over. But if you look at the state of the economy of India and the people of India, it's shameful that half a century after that historic independence movement, millions of children still die every year in India because they don't have clean drinking water. And when they do get diarrhea, their parents cannot afford medicine. So this is that the death rate of children in India is much higher than the death rate of children in China. And if you take that as part of the systemic violence in the economic system of the world, you can see that the Indian economic system, which suppresses tribal people, which suppresses landless laborers, which suppresses women who do not have any right to resources to get well water, is a much more violent system. And believe me, it is extremely violent. The landlords and the money lenders hold a very bloody baton over the heads of poor people who are often bonded laborers in their service. But there is a corner of India that has a good news story.
Okay, let's hear about that.
You want to hear about that? The southwestern state of India is called Kerala. It's a very beautiful place. I don't want to make a paradise out of it, but it is one of my favorite places to visit. If you want to go to a tropical paradise, go to Kerala.
And you've been all over the place, so this is saying something.
And
all over the world, and you're picking Kerala, so that's saying
two
something.
Two of my favorite places to be really are in the Pyrenees, in southern France, and in Kerala.
Okay.
Just as to go and visit there and just see the splendors of the place. And Kerala has the same income per person as the rest of India, so it's not more or less poor. And there are a lot of rich people in poor countries. Tiny slice, high differences of income. Kerala has an electoral democracy that's more vibrant, I think, in many ways than even the United States. Because in Kerala, it's okay to be a communist, it's okay to be a Hindu fundamentalist, it's okay to be a Muslim. Everybody has their political party. It's okay to be social democratic, it's okay to have your capitalistic party. Everybody's in the electoral arena. So there have been communist governments that have been elected. There have been communist governments that have been thrown out of office. The people are in charge. They have ration shops where a retired farmer can go and buy his monthly ration of grains and wheat and rice with a monthly retirement that he gets as a peasant. They have minimum wages that are enforced, so he can live with his son and daughter-in-law and not feel like he's a burden. So it's a kind of a social security system. Now, the infant mortality rate, so there's a democracy in Kerala. It has nearly 100% literacy. It has a very vibrant free press, which is where I am politically, because without a free intercourse, our institute is dead anyway.
Yeah.
We are all about that. But if you look at the infant mortality in Kerala, it is much more like in the West. It's not as low as the United States. United States is higher than places like France. But it's more like many Western countries were 50 years ago than like the rest of India. It's more like China than it is like the rest of India. If you look at the maternal mortality rate, you will find it is more like the West, or the West 50 years ago. If you look at longevity and life expectancy, it is so. Despite it shows that you don't need a huge amount of material wealth to be healthy, to be literate, they have a science movement, a grassroots science movement, operating in all the schools that is done by non-government organizations. So it's not like there's a big brother government sitting doing everything. It's the grassroots organizations that are actually ensuring no matter which party is in power, and I don't think actually the left is in power currently. I think it's some other political parties that are in power.
So is it the mentality of the residents of Kerala that makes this different? So are they more apt than other people in India or people elsewhere to volunteer their time to do things like this science course and to go out and vote when it's election day, for instance?
Yeah, I think people do vote all over India, although in some places where the landlords rule, for instance, the Dalits, so-called untouchables by the upper caste, they're not allowed to vote. Very often their landlords have their hired thugs and who prevent the poor people from voting. So voter participation is very strong throughout India, but especially in places like Kerala. The women's education is a very, very strong and important root of the Kerala. And I think it goes back, when you start going back, you find one thing leads to another. Kerala had a very militant role in the struggle against British imperialism. And at the same time, the history of Kerala and demanding education and organizing. So I do think it is rooted in the local culture, but in the organizing culture of the people to fend for themselves and organize together to make sure that people weren't getting totally left out. I'm not saying Kerala doesn't have inequalities or caste discrimination or many other problems or poverty. It has lots of problems. Just like the United States has lots of problems, or any place. There's no place free of problems. But it does not have the egregious nature of problems that you find in most of the third world, what you would expect to find by the low per capita income.
I want to get back to your book. You use a term in your book called global apartheid, and I think you describe it as the difference between rich and poor worldwide, similar to the difference between blacks and whites in South Africa during the time of apartheid. And I'd like you to talk more about global apartheid.
Yeah, there's a class and caste component to riches and poverty, what you might call a social political side and an economic side. And because South Africa is really, and I wasn't the person who invented this term, it was actually a fellow who wrote a little monograph, Gernot Kohler, who first came up with the term to my knowledge, and then other people have also remarked on it, like Adam Hochschild, who visited South Africa, and somebody's written about it in The Nation recently. Global apartheid means, essentially, if you look at the whole world as an economic unit, and that's what the chairman of IBM says, the world is an economic unit. The lines between countries are just lines of ethnicity and language. They're not of concern to IBM. They're not of concern to Exxon. They're not of concern to Ford. And so if you look at the economy from which the raw materials come, the oil come, for where the manufacturing is done, where the marketing is done, that's essentially all people in the world are encompassed in this economy. If you look at that economy and you say, well, how does it function for the people? And you compare it to South Africa during the time of apartheid, the comparison is absolutely stunning and remarkable. You find a great divide. So if you look at the statistics for the whites in South Africa and the statistics for blacks in South Africa, blacks are 80%, whites are 20%. Blacks meaning blacks, Indians, coloreds. The maternal mortality, the infant mortality of whites in South Africa was more like Europe and the West and North America and Japan. The mortality of children and maternal mortality for blacks was more like the mortality in the third world. If you look at life expectancy, if you look at income expectancy, if you look at all of the economic and social data, that divide that was there is almost exactly reproduced throughout the world. As I said, you have to, throughout the world, China has to be put aside as a big exception, and that is discussed at length in my book, and it's too complicated to say more than what I've said in this context.
For another program.
For another program, we can talk about China. And maybe you should have somebody from China talk about China.
Yeah, okay.
I have visited China too, and written a little bit about it. But so there's that. You cannot maintain these differences of income, of wages for the same work. If you look at the work that blacks did and the work that whites did, the wage differences in South Africa were immense. If you look at work in a factory for the same productivity of work, for the same output of work, what might happen in Mexico or Taiwan or the Philippines or Singapore or China or India or Bangladesh, the wages are fantastically different. Today. You cannot maintain those kinds of wages without a very strong militarist repression. That militarist repression happens primarily through the system of borders, customs, passports. There are people who die every day at the US-Mexican border. South Africa also had that. They had their system of reservations, which they called Bantustans for blacks. They had people that they made to work in the mines, that they had their camps that they built for them, just like the migrant workers that there may be in the United States, or the people who work in the mines in Congo or other parts of Africa. So down to the detail of the repressive system to keep people out of the high wage areas, the better places to build homes, the amount of land that was occupied. The West occupied an enormous amount of land outside of Europe. Many times, 5 times, 6 times the area of land was occupied by Europeans in the 19th century. And their population grew enormously. Now, of course, the people who are occupying a smaller amount of space, they're not allowed to leave their space and go to this land because they're told that you have to stay out. And they're forcibly kept out, even though goods are flowing freely. So capital is flowing, goods are flowing, and the elites are traveling. The borders are transparent to the elites. But the poor, just like in apartheid, the mobility of the poor workers was rigidly controlled and was done by race. On a global level, it is rigidly controlled and done by nationality. So race and nationality, race in South Africa and nationality, as it's identified with the military system, is actually, they're very parallel concepts. Maybe a shocking thing to say, but I do think it's worth at least thinking about.
I can't help but to think about the current dispensation of the war on terrorism and the effect it's having on basically what you're saying about the ability for people in places to move across borders, but also of the safety of people to move across borders. And I'm not only talking about people coming into the United States, but I'm talking about Americans going to other countries.
Yeah, well, of course now it has become less safe for Americans to go to other countries or Westerners to go to other countries, as it has been very difficult for poor people. For people like, for me from Bombay, it has been relatively easy to travel, and I can still travel quite easily. But now it has become more difficult and more complex for everybody. It remains very porous to capital. The immigration issue really is, first of all, an issue of borders and the global economy, and predates September 11th and the war on terror. Because if you look at the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe, the rise of neo-fascist parties, the rise of neo-fascist violence, a great deal of it is really centered on immigration, which is the same kind of conflict as there was between white workers and black workers, say, in the last part of the 19th century, when racism was cultivated as a tool among white workers. You know, in the middle of the 19th century, the Irish immigrants from the famine and black workers were very much together in places like New York. There used to be signs, Irish and dogs not allowed. So, and the Irish felt closer to blacks than they did to the whites that were putting up those signs. After Reconstruction ended and essentially the fate of black people was given over back to the South in 1877 with the a very funny election that happened in 1877, which is worth looking at and comparing to the last election. There was a concerted move to separate white workers from black workers, in the same way that borders separate Mexican workers on the other side of the maquiladoras. They are there, they're kept there militaristically by the border guard. General Motors can pick up and close factories, textile, and they can pick up and close factories and go there, but the Mexican workers cannot cross. So this differential mobility really has created a situation of antagonism between ordinary people who feel, well, the Mexican workers took away my job. Why should they take? And so it creates the same kind of problems, as I was saying. This nationality problem and the race problem are very, very parallel. And there's an anti-immigrant sentiment that I can actually understand that has now gotten all mixed up with religious questions and the war on terror and the aftermath of the murders that happened. And I'd be happy to talk more about that side of it, because it's very, very complicated. But
I want to explore more about the worker who thinks about the worker in Mexico taking his or her job. How should that person be thinking of this?
Well, it is a very difficult situation, because workers' rights were won by very, very hard organizing. People, went on strikes and got shot and their families starved. I mean, if you look at Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, it's a great book. It will give you a lot of the really difficult history of people actually getting workers' rights and economic rights and political rights in this country, blacks and whites, men and women, and so on. But at the same time, what the establishment did in the same period was to set up this system of global apartheid. They created these borders, and workers in the West did not see that for a very long time, because there was no manufacturing over there. It was all separation of labor for raw materials and agriculture, and the manufacturing was concentrated here. Now that has changed, and there's electricity in Mexico, there's electricity in the Philippines, there's electricity even in places like Bangladesh and India, and so it is possible to do cheap manufacturing, which is very productive over there. So workers are actually, in the United States, because of this, have seen about half of the workers still do not make as much as they did in 1973. We talk about the boom, about economic growth, and yet ordinary people are struggling. And they are struggling because there is a differential mobility. If workers had the right to mobility that was equivalent to the right of capital for mobility, then I think it would be possible to organize with greater solidarity. And today, that is actually happening. The big labor unions used to be quite anti-immigrant in the United States, but that has changed in the last 5 years.
Right. Going back to your book, totally switching gears, you describe the French Revolution as a very key point in world history, and I want you to describe why.
Well, the French Revolution is usually seen as a watershed in European history, or the ideas about democracy. Marx wrote about it as the prototype of the bourgeois revolution. But I've kind of looked at the French Revolution from a little bit different point of view. It was many of those things, but the first couple of 100 years of capitalism, say from the middle of the 15th century, 1450 or so, to the end of the 19th century, the people of Europe did not benefit, even though there was a lot of robbery of the Americas and all the gold that the people who went after Christopher Columbus brought back, and all the genocide that went on in South America, etc. The workers in England earned less at the end of the 19th century than they did in the middle of the 15th century. There were terrible famines in France. Paris was full of beggars, the way you might see in many third world cities today. So the French Revolution came out of a mass of poverty and miseries, with very few riches at the top by the royalty, the aristocracy, and the aristocracy in the church too. And when the revolution overthrew the monarchy and got to the point where the king and queen of France were beheaded, the rich people of Europe were terrorized, basically in the same way as, say, the slave owners were terrorized by Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. The rich people felt it's very dangerous to have militant, poor people living on the same streets as us. And so at that point, it was the same time as the technological revolution, as I've said. And so at that time, the revolt of the poor translated into a global division of labor where cotton was grown by slaves in the United States. And you know, many people don't know that during the Civil War, when cotton was not being grown by slaves for the British industry, the British actually went to Egypt and set up a system of indentured bonded labor over there. So they shifted slavery to Egypt, essentially, to grow cotton and send it to England. So this division of labor where cheap labor was created over there and poverty was shifted over there, and food was brought from India, from conquered lands in the United States, from Russia into Germany, to keep European workers happy. Surplus populations were exported from Ireland, from Germany. France was the only country that did not export a huge amount of surplus population or import a huge amount of food in Western Europe. And so basically, the French Revolution was a watershed in capitalist history because it's the event which politically dates and militarily dates the start of this modern structure of global apartheid, in my opinion.
And so what I see as having changed is that we're not seeing as much, and this is sort of a question, we're not seeing as much of the outflow of capital, raw materials, I should say, from these colonialized, so-called third world countries. But we're seeing walls go up at the borders of so-called rich countries so that these people can't come in. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, I think the walls are there. The resources are still coming largely, many resources are still largely coming from the third world. If you listen to the talk about oil, which is the most vital of them all, oil comes largely from the Persian Gulf, which has 2/3 of the world's oil resources. And during the first oil crisis, when I first came to Washington, or just before that, it used to be said that the lifeline of the West runs through the Persian Gulf. Well, that's a very interesting thing. You know, the lifeline of the West is not in the West. And it has been that way for 500 years. And that's the whole point about global apartheid. So the resources, where's the copper coming from? Where are the diamonds? Diamonds are very useful not only for jewelry, they're essential in industry. Where are they coming from? Where's the tantalum in the cell phones coming from? Where is the oil coming from?
Right.
There's a lot that is actually mined in the West. The uranium for nuclear power comes from Canada and Australia. It comes to some extent from Russia and Kazakhstan too.
Not the U.S.?
The U.S. has very little uranium production anymore in the United States. A very low-grade uranium ores. That's why it's costly to produce it here. And then all the wastes, of course, are left there in Africa and Canada and so on. So there is a flow of cheap labor that's embodied in goods. There is a flow of resources. There's also markets in the third world, because there are many wealthy people in the third world. And they are the ones that are very instrumental in the global apartheid system in actually maintaining these inequalities. I mean, that's why the United States and the West is so involved, has been involved sometimes in toppling democratic governments and setting up friendly dictatorships. And well, Saudi Arabia is a good example of a friendly dictatorship and a fundamentalist government. They've toppled unfriendly democratic governments for the sake of promoting corporate interests and so on. Saddam Hussein has been a friend of the United States in the past in the pursuit of oil politics.
As has Osama bin Laden, I believe.
Yes, in the whole strategy of the U.S. in regard to Soviet containment was not just about keeping the Soviets out of Europe. It was about keeping nationalism, including secular nationalism, and independent nationalist influence and any support it might get from the Soviet Union out of the third world in the decolonization era. There were a lot of independence movements after World War II. They were gathering a lot of steam, and the idea was to keep them in the Western orbit with nominal independence, and because that freed them up from European control and allowed American influence to grow. So the United States actually supported independence to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent. If it got too far, as it did in Vietnam or Algeria or other places, then it became a problem, Guatemala or Iran. Then these became candidates for toppling the governments or worse.
Yeah. In your book, it's called From Global Capitalism to Economic Justice, and the subtitle says that it is an inquiry. But I wonder if you could go beyond the inquiry and tell us how we get from global capitalism to economic justice.
Well, as I've said, I have a very foggy view. Nobody can have a really clear view. We are so, at least I cannot. I shouldn't say nobody. I don't know what other views other people have. I know some of them, but I surely don't know all of them. I think part of the key lies in the differential flows of money and labor. Capital is flowing so much faster than people that we must put more restraints on the flow of capital, and we must free up the flow of people. How is this possible without creating chaos and, say, reducing wages over here and being overwhelmed with immigrant cheap labor? I think the key to that, and that is really a huge problem. That's a problem we should address centrally, and which I've tried to do by proposing a different way of structuring the world's money system. So the international monetary system, which is the guardian of the money system of the world, directed by the US Treasury, as everybody acknowledges, including the Washington Post. They actually wrote an interesting editorial about it once. The job of the IMF, effectively, the result of what they do has been to keep cheap labor across these borders. So they're always asking for devaluation of third world currencies, and that causes a lot of capital flight and keeps Mexican labor, say, much cheaper than its relative productivity. So Mexican laborers are producing a lot, but they're not getting paid for it. If we have a different kind of monetary system, where the monies of countries are really at purchasing power parity. What do I mean by that? That means if you go to a restaurant here and get a good meal, an ordinary restaurant, for $5, you should
That's pretty
be
cheap.
able to get, or $10, you should be able to get a similar meal, same amount of calories, same kind of cleanliness of service, or so on. Or if you look at what a Coca-Cola might cost you here, it might cost you 75 cents or $1. And if you look what an equivalent sanitary drink might cost you in Bombay, which is coconut. That's my preferred drink in Bombay. You can buy coconut water on the street stands there. Very healthy. Well, coconut
I wouldn't
cost-
say that Coca-Cola is very healthy, though.
I don't know about, let's say traditional. By now traditional. Yes, I agree. Coconut water, much healthy, to be recommended. So the Indian rupee today is worth about 2 cents in exchange rate terms. If you compare purchasing power, it actually costs me only 10 cents or 12 cents to buy coconut water that's clean and healthy in Bombay as a soft drink to quench my thirst. It costs $1 or 75 cents to do it here. So you can see the Indian rupee is actually undervalued by, I would say, 5 times to 10 times relative to the US dollar. What does this do? It keeps the Indians wanting to break out and come to the United States where they can make more money for the same labor, or the Mexicans or the Filipinos, or to go to Europe, or Moroccans to go to Spain, and so on. And it allows corporations to shut down the factories here and move them to Mexico and move them to India and move them to the Philippines. So you see, it creates this system where you have to repress people in order to allow corporate profits. If you change the monetary system, and believe me, it's not going to happen easily. It's as hard as getting nuclear disarmament, which I know very well is very hard.
Yeah.
But we have to struggle for it. if we don't have an equalitarian monetary system where people are really getting paid for the labor they put forth, but rather they're getting paid for something the IMF says they should get paid, then we're never going to see, we're going to have this, maintain this terrible system which prefers profits over people. And I'm not against profits. I think corporations should be accountable to communities where they are located. They should be subject to oversight boards. They should make their information public. They should allow us to see the toxics that they are discharging. The kind of laws that we have in the United States in many ways should be globalized for global corporations. They should have to file environmental impact statements and so on. Some corporations are actually ready to do this.
Ready to standardize the monetary system of the world?
Not standardize the monetary system. I was referring more to the information.
To be accountable.
Actually, you may not know this even because this was before your time at the Institute, Lisa. We did a study for the United Nations on the role of corporations in global climate change. And I represented the UN Center on Transnational Corporations in a UN conference of governments. And there I met someone from the World Chamber of Commerce, also from a very large European corporation, who were corporate representatives to the conference. And I was suggesting that corporations should voluntarily publish information about the toxicity of their products, about the climate change and so on. And they agreed more readily than the US and British government representatives. So I think there is a very strong case to be made that corporations should be subject to the informational and regulatory control to some extent of the communities in which they operate. They should be transparent. They should be responsible. I'm not particularly in favor of big government compared to big corporations. I am more a fan, which I talk about, of a concept in this book, which was actually coined, a term that was coined by somebody who lives in the Twin Cities, David Morris. David Morris established the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Local self-reliance doesn't mean you don't import anything. Local self-reliance means you rely as much as possible locally. You trade freely, people move freely, but if you can generate electricity locally, you do it. If you can grow vegetables in your garden or buy them at your local farmer's market, you do that.
And they taste better sometimes.
And they taste better, and you know what's in them, and it's a very good democratic protection against terrorist interference with your food.
Yeah, I never thought of that. Well, so how can people in this community, in the Twin Cities or in the larger metropolitan area, kind of, what can we do in terms of either local self-reliance or getting from global capitalism to economic justice?
Well, you can read my book. A third edition of the book is going to come out, in which it was published in '92, and I bring the matter up to date in a long new preface, which is tentatively entitled On Freedom and Equality, on the struggle for global democracy, because I think we have to be for global democracy, not just anti-corporatization of the world. You can contact the Institute for Local Self-Reliance about local self-reliance ideas. They have very good ideas. They're actually located in Washington, D.C. I know David Morris writes for the local papers. You can actually try to work with the corporations. I know there are some corporations here who are quite progressive and are willing to make their stuff public, but they don't do it in other countries. So the same corporations that operate in the United States do it one way here and another way in other countries. So I think the information for corporations to be made public is a very, very important thing, to work with workers, to work with corporations, because I don't think too much in the way of interesting regulation is going to come out of Washington. So people have to take the initiative at the local level. And the other thing I think that should be done is to support an international legal system that functions to hold corporations and people accountable. The US has rejected the International Criminal Court. I think cities can support the International Criminal Court. I think cities are passing innovative legislation to protect immigrants in the face of repression from Washington, D.C. I think cities,
Portland, Oregon, I believe,
Portland,
yes.
Oregon, Ithaca, Cambridge, Berkeley, Minneapolis could do that if it hasn't already. I don't know, I haven't inquired into it. But I think cities can also take the initiative to promote the International Criminal Court, something that really gives equality before the law to individuals.
Yeah.
Whether they're serving heads of state or the poorest person.
And you wrote a report about the rule of law, or at least you edited one. And just in the next minute or so, tell us about that before my last question.
Yeah, actually Nicole Deller and John Burroughs and I edited it, and there are a number of authors. We're very worried that the United States, which helped give the world the idea of the rule of law, for which it is admired everywhere, now has a government in Washington, D.C. that says they're not obliged to obey their treaty commitments to the world. And this is a very destructive direction, and that should be reversed. And so we wrote a report called The Rule of Power or the Rule of Law, ? And it's going to come out as an Apex Press book next month, or in January.
Good. And I want, in the last minute, you to talk about what you foresee for the future in terms of what we've been talking about today. What are the prospects?
Well, the negative side everybody can see writ large. You know, there's a lot of militarism, that ideas of terrorism, which were initially state-sponsored, you know, large-scale bombing, air warfare, have now spread to non-government groups. Osama bin Laden has learned his lessons about Hiroshima from the U.S. government. It's very sad that this murderous ideology is spreading. But there is a good news side. There is an international environmental movement that knows how to struggle together. Since Beijing Women's Conference, United Nations Women's Conference, there's an international women's movement. Workers, as I said, in this country who used to be anti-immigrant are working together across borders. There's Maria Jimenez of the American Friends Service Committee who did a borders project and she's Mexican and American both, and to fight repression and to work for immigrant rights. So there are a lot of things like that that people are doing to express their solidarity as human beings first. We don't become less Americans or less Mexican if we assert that we are human beings together.
Thank you for ending on that hopeful note, Dr. Makhijani, and thank you for joining us. Thanks for watching Altera Vista.